Okay, so the same Treasury Secretary who just told us the economy is booming and prices are falling just got caught on national television lying about grocery prices using Donald Trump's own economic data. And in the same hearing, he refused to promise that Trump won't sue the Federal Reserve Chair if interest rates don't drop fast enough. And then a senator looked him dead in the eye and called him absolutely childish for refusing to hold two massive taxpayer-backed institutions accountable for breaking federal law. And somehow, the person doing all of this is the guy who's supposed to be managing the American economy. So this past week, the Senate Banking Committee held a hearing on financial stability. That's the session where Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent presents the Financial Stability Oversight Council's annual report and answers questions about the economy. And what came out of that hearing is one of the clearest illustrations of what this administration is actually doing versus what they say they're doing. Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Jack Reed spent about 10 minutes absolutely dismantling Secretary Bessent's claims about affordability, about Trump's promises, and about basic accountability. Take a look at this, and I'll give you my breakdown at the end.
For a solid year while he ran for president, Donald Trump promised pretty much every day that he was going to lower costs on day one, if he was elected. Those were his words, not mine. So, Secretary Bessent, you are one of the president's top economic advisors. Let's just start with a little truth-telling about the Trump economy 1 year in. Affordability is the top concern for Americans across the country. Donald Trump has called affordability, I want to get this right, a hoax. He's called it a scam. He's called it a con job. You're the Secretary of Treasury. You know the numbers. Is affordability a hoax, a scam, or a con job?
Senator, it may be a bit nuanced for you, but what President Trump is referring to is the media saying that the affordability crisis was generated by this administration when it was you and President Biden who destroyed the buying power of the American people. So there is an affordability crisis, and you were front and center in it.
So let me make sure that I understand. Donald Trump is not saying that affordability, what's happening to families right now, is a hoax?
He is saying that trying to lay the blame at this administration rather than the Biden-Warren economy is a hoax.
Okay, so it all happened before he got it. And everything that's happened since then, nothing is a hoax here.
21.5% cumulative inflation.
Let me just ask about what's happened in the 1 year that Donald Trump has been president. Last week, President Trump said, quote, "We have the groceries going down." Did grocery prices drop in 2025?
Numerous prices have.
Did grocery prices drop in 2025?
Numerous grocery prices have gone down.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you can't hear me. Did grocery prices drop in 2025?
Numerous grocery prices have gone down.
Some of them.
And in fact, we have seen inflation at 2.1% for the past 3 months.
Have you seen the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that is Donald Trump's own Bureau of Labor Statistics numbers, that report that grocery prices were 2.4% higher at the end of 2025 than they were at the end of 2024. Trump's own Department of Agriculture has projected that those prices would climb higher in 2026. And under Donald Trump, families are paying more and more for groceries. So if you're just going to insult people by denying the facts that are out there and tell people they're doing great when they're struggling, I think that's just another way to say you don't have a plan to bring down these prices. You're not willing to admit the failures of the Trump administration.
Senator.
I will ask you a question in just a sec here. It's not just groceries. The numbers from Trump's own economic agency show that Americans are paying more for utility bills, more for health care, more for housing construction. Families aren't fooled by these lies. Mr. Secretary, you owe it to American families to own up what's going on. And Secretary Bessent, I have one more question for you while I have you here. You ran the search for Donald Trump's Fed chair nominee. And Trump promised, quote, anyone that disagrees with me will never be Fed chairman. Kevin Warsh got the nod last Friday, and then over the weekend, Donald Trump joked that he would sue Mr. Warsh if he failed to lower interest rates. At least, I think it was a joke. But just in case, this should be an easy one, Mr. Secretary. Can you commit right here and now that Trump's Fed nominee, Kevin Warsh, will not be sued, will not be investigated by the Department of Justice if he doesn't cut interest rates exactly the way that Donald Trump wants?
That is up to the president. Can you commit that you will?
I'm sorry.
Can you commit that you will not hold up?
He won't be sued if he doesn't drop interest rates.
And
he won't be criminally investigated.
The president also made a joke about you that I won't repeat, Senator Warren.
That was the
actually, I will.
one.
He said he had reservations.
If this was a joke, why not just say so?
It was a joke, and he made a joke about you too, Senator Warren.
Yes,
he got a lot of laughs. Got a lot of laughs.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want to respond to that.
I do want to respond.
What I can't tell you
the American
is
people
Mr.
are
Warsh
laughing.
is highly qualified.
They're the ones who are struggling with affordability.
Why don't you tell the nation what you told me, that you held up Chair Powell's renomination?
We're going to move on to the next one. Senator Rounds, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, first of all, thanks for being here and for your service to our nation. I'm going to come back in and talk a little bit on the technical side for just a minute. The FSOC's 2025 annual report recommends that its member agencies use the Council's Artificial Intelligence Working Group to identify regulatory impediments to the responsible adoption of AI by financial institutions. From your perspective, what are the biggest impediments today that prevent banks from adopting AI responsibly, especially for compliance, fraud detection, and risk management?
Well, as you know, AI is an exciting and new technology, and there's a great amount of learning to do here. So FSOC, Treasury, the regulatory agencies are working with our private partners to implement in a gradual way robust usage of AI. AI can be a great tool, but we have to also think that AI can be a risk through state and non-state actors. So it is a public-private partnership, and we are pushing very hard across the agencies and at Treasury.
FSOC's report also recognizes that overly complex and subjective supervision, like reliance on vague concepts, such as reputational risk, as you mentioned in your opening statement, restricts valuable activities. Given FSOC's push for clearer standards and responsible AI adoption, would a time-limited AI sandbox for financial institutions with clear guardrails help firms test AI tools in a controlled setting while regulators evaluate risks and benefits?
Senator, that is clearly the one very interesting option, and we are considering that moving forward. We'd be happy to work with your staff on that.
I feel very passionate about that part of it. I would look forward to working with your team as well, sir. I'm also just curious. We've talked now, and the discussion will go on and on about how we build the economy and so forth. But I think just for the American public, since they probably don't get an opportunity to just have a back and forth with the Secretary of the Treasury very often, let's talk a little bit about how we really reduce the price of getting a home for an American family. I think a lot of it has to do with bringing down the interest rates that charge in a 30-year mortgage. Can you share with us a little bit, we talked about treasuries, and you mentioned that the rate of treasuries, the cost of treasuries is coming down. Can you share a little bit about what it takes to bring down the price of treasuries with regard to the growth of GDP? And when treasury rates come down, what that does for an average American home buyer who's looking at a 30-year mortgage?
Well, I'd be glad to, Senator, because President Trump is focused on Main Street and not Harvard Square. So a mortgage rate is two components. We could say that it is a derivative of the 10-year, but it's really a 7.5-year. And we have seen that decline. And then it is the spread between the 10-year bond and the actual mortgage security, and we have seen that is at multi-year lows. So what we saw in January was the lowest mortgage rates in almost 3 years.
You know, we've got $37 trillion in debt. A lot of the folks back out there saying if you've got that much debt and you're paying interest on it, that competes with folks that want to loan you money on a mortgage. Can you talk about what it means to build GDP and how someone who is looking at laying out bonds and so forth as you build GDP, what that does and how that impacts a homeowner?
Well, yes, because two things, sir. We brought down the fiscal deficit for the calendar year. So from 2024 to 2025, at 2024, the deficit to GDP, which is a very important number, was 6.97%, highest when we weren't at war or in a recession. We brought it down to 5.4. That was a combination of the holding spending and growing the economy. And as we continue to do that, interest rates will naturally decline, and it pushes the out inflation. What we could see from an MIT study was that the Democrats' spending that was responsible for almost half of the great inflation. The overspending, according to MIT, was responsible for that and penalized American homeowners. So by controlling the budget, growing, and in a responsible way, we will bring down mortgage rates. And I would say that building costs are now down in the year.
Thank you.
I want to break down exactly what is happening here, because there are layers and most of them are not being reported. Let's start with the receipts you didn't see in that exchange, because this is somehow even worse than it looks. First, let's talk about the Bureau of Labor Statistics data that Warren referenced. I actually pulled the numbers myself because I wanted to make sure this was accurate. According to the BLS Consumer Price Index summary for December 2025, which was released January 15th, 2026, the Food at Home Index, that's groceries, increased 2.4% over the last 12 months. Not decreased, increased. That's Trump's own Department of Labor reporting those numbers. But here's what you didn't hear in that clip. The USDA, Trump's Department of Agriculture, released their food price outlook on January 23rd, 2026. And in that report, they project that food prices will increase another 2 to 3% in 2026. So not only did prices go up in 2025, they're projected to go up again this year. Now, I could not write this if I tried, and I write scripts for a living. Trump spent an entire year campaigning on lowering costs on day one. He said it at every rally. He said it in every interview, day one. Those were his words. And now his own economic agencies are publishing data showing that costs went up. And his Treasury Secretary sits before Congress and will not admit it. He kept saying numerous grocery prices have gone down. Not that grocery prices overall dropped, numerous. That's the word you use when you're trying to mislead someone without technically lying. Now let's talk about what Warren exposed with the Federal Reserve question, because this should genuinely terrify you. The Federal Reserve has been independent since 1913. That independence is not a suggestion. It's the foundation of our entire monetary system. When the Fed makes decisions about interest rates, they do it based on economic data, inflation targets, and employment numbers, not based on what the president wants. Every serious economist, regardless of political party, will tell you that Fed independence is non-negotiable. It's what separates us from countries where the central bank is just an extension of whatever the leader wants. It's what keeps the dollar stable. It's what prevents political interference from destroying our economy. And Trump openly said he would sue his own Fed chair nominee if interest rates don't drop, not as policy, as a threat. And Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, refused to say that's inappropriate. He said it's up to the president. Here's what that means in practice. If you're Kevin Walsh, the Fed chair nominee, and you're making decisions about interest rates, you now have to consider whether the president of the United States will sue you if you make a decision he doesn't like. That's not independence. That's coercion. And I want you to understand something. This isn't about whether rates should go up or down. This is about whether the person making that decision can do so without fear of being sued or investigated by the very administration they're supposed to be independent from. What you just watched wasn't 3 separate issues. It was one pattern playing out across 3 different topics. Let me show you what I mean. On grocery prices, Besant refuses to acknowledge what Trump's own data shows. He deflects. He blames Biden. He cherry-picks individual items instead of answering the actual question. On the Fed chair threat, Besant refuses to commit that Trump won't sue or investigate independent officials. He deflects. He says it's up to the president. He acts like he has no say in protecting institutional independence. And then with Senator Reid, and you saw this at the very end of that clip, Reid starts asking about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These are the two government-sponsored enterprises that back most mortgages in America. And according to Reid's questioning, both institutions are currently violating federal law. The director appointed himself to both boards, even though the law explicitly prohibits it. The boards aren't independent, even though the law requires it. The audit committees aren't properly structured, even though regulations mandate it. And when Reid asks Besant how Treasury will bring them into compliance, Besant says that's not Treasury's job. Except here's the thing. Treasury provided a $200 billion bailout to these institutions. Treasury holds 1 million preferred shares on behalf of taxpayers. Treasury has a warrant to purchase up to 80% of their common stock. Treasury staff manages these assets, and Treasury has the legal authority to place them back into conservatorship if they're not following the law. So when Besant says, "not my problem," what he's really saying is, I'm going to abdicate responsibility for enforcing the law at taxpayer-backed institutions, even though that's literally my job. Let me give you some context you couldn't get from just watching that exchange. Donald Trump made his promise about lowering costs on day one all throughout 2024. I'm talking hundreds of times. At rallies, in interviews, in campaign ads, on social media. Day one, lower costs, day one. Inauguration was January 20th, 2025. We are now in February 2026. That's over a year. And according to Trump's own economic agencies, costs are higher than they were when he took office. The BLS reports grocery prices up 2.4%. The Census Bureau reports median rent up 4.1%. The Energy Information Administration reports residential electricity prices up 3.8%. The Bureau of Economic Analysis reports healthcare costs up 5.2%. Those aren't my numbers. Those aren't Democratic talking points. Those are Trump's own federal agencies publishing their official data. And Besant sat before Congress and pretended that's not reality. Now, here's what makes this even more absurd. Trump himself has started calling affordability concerns a hoax. He's used the words hoax, scam, and con job to describe people complaining about high prices. The same prices his own agencies confirm are high. So what you're watching is an administration that promised to fix affordability, failed to fix affordability, and is now gaslighting the American people by claiming affordability isn't even a real problem. So let me tell you what this actually means for you, the person watching this from your couch who just wants to know why any of this matters. If the Treasury Secretary is willing to lie to Congress about something as basic as grocery prices, something you can verify yourself by walking into any store, what else is he lying about? If he can't tell the truth about the price of eggs, why would you trust him on inflation projections, on deficit reduction, on economic growth? If the administration is threatening to sue the Federal Reserve Chair for making independent decisions, that fundamentally undermines the stability of our entire financial system. Every economist knows this. Every serious policymaker knows this. And Besant knows this. But he's willing to let it happen anyway because protecting Trump is more important than protecting the institution. And if Treasury is refusing to enforce federal law at Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, two institutions that taxpayers bailed out and that taxpayers are still on the hook for if they fail, who exactly is supposed to hold them accountable? These aren't private companies. These are government-sponsored enterprises backed by your money. And the person whose job it is to oversee them just said he doesn't have time for that. Here's the thing you can tell people when this comes up. This administration made a very specific promise. Lower costs, day one. That was the deal. And not only did they not deliver on that promise, they're now denying that the problem even exists while their own data proves it does. What this is really about isn't grocery prices. It's not about the Fed. It's not about Fannie Mae. It's about whether anyone in this administration is willing to tell the truth and take responsibility when things don't go according to plan. You have a Treasury Secretary who lies about basic economic data, who refuses to protect institutional independence, who abdicates responsibility for enforcing the law at taxpayer-backed institutions. And when confronted with all of this, his response is to blame Biden, deflect to other agencies, and pretend he has no power to do anything. That's not governance. That's a con. And Senator Reid was right to call it childish, because that's exactly what it is. It's a grown man refusing to take responsibility for the job he signed up to do. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This isn't partisan spin. You just watched it happen on video. The Treasury Secretary of the United States got caught lying using the president's own economic data, refused to protect the Federal Reserve from political threats, and refused to enforce federal law at institutions backed by taxpayer money. And the scariest part, he didn't even try to hide it. He just sat there and did it right in front of Congress, right in front of the cameras, as if this is somehow normal now. Before you go, if this breakdown helped you see what's really going on, make sure you like the video, subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive, turn on notifications so you're the first to know when we post, and share this with someone else who deserves the full story, not the spin.